Greetings everyone. Hope all of you are having an absolutely fantastic day. Let's get into breaking down the mechanics for the various classes in Dark Envoy, starting with Ranger. I made Malachi Ranger and really enjoyed the experience, so looking forward to getting into this with all of you. Before we start going over the skills, I think it would probably be beneficial to talk about how I decided to upgrade his attributes so that you can understand a little bit better some of the numbers you'll see when we go into the skills. So I focused on might, which is going to increase my critical chance and weapon damage. And then I also really focused on speed, which is going to increase my attack speed, but it's also going to significantly reduce my cooldowns. And so you'll notice when we look at skills, some of the cooldowns are much lower than they probably will be for some of you starting out. And then I completely ignored endurance and I completely ignored power. So you'll see in a lot of the skills, the actual damage that they do is very low because it's really his basic attacks that do the majority of damage against enemies. And then finally, I did put a few points in mastery just to get that initial 25% increase to critical damage. And once I cap out speed, I probably will focus on mastery to see if I can get that other increase of critical damage by 50%. All right, let's go ahead and get into the skills. First and foremost, you should recognize that the lit up area constitutes the skills that you can actually select. So these lower ones that are in the darkened area, you need to put a certain amount of points into the tree before the game will allow you to select them. So starting from the top, in cover will give you an additional dodge chance of up to 20%. There's cover everywhere throughout the environment, so it's usually pretty easy to get into cover. It doesn't necessarily make you safer because enemies come from all directions, so you can easily roll into cover and have an enemy right next to you. But this will absolutely help protect you more if you are heavily investing into speed, because speed is going to increase your dodge chance. So you'll see here, I've got basically a 1 in 4 chance of dodging any attack that comes towards my character, and it definitely helps to mitigate damage. So I decided this was something worth investing in. The next skill is Toxic Bomb, which is going to deal poison damage to all enemies in a 3-meter radius, and it's going to confuse them for 20 seconds while also creating a surface that poisons any enemies that step onto it. This skill has a status synergy where if you use it on an enemy that's already confused, the skill will deal additional poison damage and it will cause those enemies to become berserk. Confused enemies deal, I think, around 20% less weapon damage. Berserk enemies are forced to attack the nearest character, whether they be an enemy or an ally. And poisoned enemies have the temporary HP they receive from healing to be lowered by 50%, while they also experience poison damage every second. So altogether, this is pretty powerful stuff, but it really becomes nice when you combine it with the Amplified Poison passive, which is going to give you an increase of up to 30% weapon damage to poison targets. In the beginning of the game, this combination is absolutely your bread and butter and is going to really help you to wipe out enemies. Long term, there's going to be so many enemies coming out that the long cooldown for Toxic Bomb of 18 seconds, it is not really as effective to consistently get this damage boost. There's an enchantment you can use to make your weapons automatically deal poison damage and poison enemies, so the passive still becomes worth it. Whereas for Toxic Bomb, I kind of phased it out over time because I wanted my rangers strictly focused on dealing damage, not necessarily dealing statuses, but you might decide this works for you. The next skill is Wind Stance, which is going to increase your attack speed for 20 seconds. If used again while active, it resets the effective timer and grants additional critical chance. So you can see the cooldown is 18 seconds, so even right at the beginning, you will potentially be able to use this again before the cooldown is finished. But there's also a passive called Skill Frenzy, which every time a nearby enemy dies, you're going to decrease your active cooldowns by up to 10%. This will absolutely help to ensure you can get that additional critical chance on a very regular basis while making all of your overall skills more available. So I think this is definitely nice to have regardless of the type of ranger build you're doing, whether it be regular attacks or just using skills. I pretty much activate wind stance whenever it's available. The next skill is blast roll. You're going to roll in a specific direction, and then you're going to deal poison and fire damage while also inflicting vulnerable for 20 seconds on enemies that are within 3 meters. If the enemies were already vulnerable, you're going to deal additional poison and fire damage, and you're going to also inflict poison and burn on those enemies. Very nice. Vulnerable enemies have their elemental resistance, except for chaos, reduced by 20%. Burned enemies are dealt fire damage every second, which increases per your level. Blast roll is an essential skill because it allows the ranger to essentially roll out of danger and away from enemies that are trying to attack it. There are 2 different upgrade paths you can take for it. The explosive roll obviously is going to deal additional damage. Personally, I don't like it because it's only going to work on enemies that are within 3 meters. So it's fantastic if enemies have walked up right on you and then you can roll away and deal some damage towards them. But oftentimes you'll recognize that a situation is getting too heated before enemies are actually close, and you'll want to just roll away in general to keep your rangers safe. So I found a lot of times this effect wouldn't trigger. I personally prefer the phantom roll, which when you roll is going to leave behind a phantom that will deal a certain amount of your damage. The ultimate version will do basically 20% less weapon damage than your base character is capable of doing. And so this is a way to ensure that enemies continue to be damaged even if they're not directly within the blast radius at the time that you roll. So personally, I prefer this, but regardless, absolutely believe that this is something you should be adding to your repertoire. Next up is Cleanse Wounds. This allows you to heal a target for a certain amount of HP, and if the target is below 50% HP, it heals them for even more hit points and removes all harmful statuses. I definitely ignored this. My ranger is completely focused on damage. There are pillars in the environment, so even if you experience a really bad fight, you can hit those pillars and it will heal your party members' damage. Even if they're on the brink of death, one hit of that pillar is going to raise them all the way back up. So personally, I didn't see a need to have a healer, but that's how things work on normal. I don't know if they change up that for hard or higher level difficulties. So this may make sense for you, but definitely if you're playing on normal, I don't think there's a need to have this skill or a dedicated healer in general. Next up is stun criticals. Your critical hits inflict stun for 2 seconds. This effect has a 4-second cooldown. Stunned enemies are completely unable to take actions. Depending on your build, this can absolutely be worth it to have. It's worth it for me. At this point, I have a critical hit chance of 95%, which obviously goes up even higher when I'm using wind stance multiple times. So I can basically guarantee that every single time I fire a bullet, it's going to stun an enemy. And with this on, I'm going to get a critical hit. And with this on, it's going to stun enemies constantly, which is a very effective debuff. So for me, at my build, it was absolutely worth it to have. Next on the list is Skill Sprint, which is going to increase the movement speed of your character for 5 seconds. I didn't find it to be worth grabbing this. You already have blast roll to use when you want to roll out of the way. And again, I heavily invested into speed, which is going to increase your movement speed anyway. So this kind of felt like overkill, and you only have a limited amount of passive you can use. Didn't feel like this would make the cut. Next up is Trap Field. You're going to place 7 traps in the field, and when an enemy moves onto it, they will explode, dealing poison damage and inflicting Shaken. Shaken reduces an enemy's movement speed by 20%. Again, me personally, I didn't focus on inflicting statuses on enemies, and so I didn't feel like this was worth it. Depending on the makeup of your team, you might have teammates who really benefit from enemies being shaken, and so in that case, this might make sense, but I focused on self-buffing and just using the regular base attacks. And then finally, you have Arrow Rain. It fires a volley down a 12-meter drawn path that lasts for 5 seconds, dealing 50% of your weapon damage. This skill also has status synergy. If enemies are already shaken, you'll inflict weakness on them for 10 seconds. Weakness decreases an enemy's weapon damage by 33%. I took Arrow Hail all the way up to the 3rd level, which is going to deal 70% weapon damage. And frankly, because the arrows come down so fast and furiously, they really shred enemies, especially if you've been able to create a choke point where enemies are basically going to just stand there. This is really nice to have, even for a build like mine where I prefer to just use base attacks. It's worth picking up in my opinion. Alright, so that's all the skills for the base ranger class. Now let's get into the specializations, and I'll start with the specialization I chose for Malachi, which is Sharpshooter. Let me say up front that I kind of regret that choice. It is absolutely powerful. Sharpshooter will let you do a ton of damage, but it's also definitely geared around dealing single target damage. And as I said in my impressions video, this game loves throwing waves upon waves of enemies at you. So I feel like it's kind of more beneficial to be geared around dealing with groups of enemies at one time as opposed to single targets. There are definitely some boss fights where it was nice having a sharpshooter, but overall I kind of felt like I was lagging behind the other ranger companion that we'll go over soon, who had bounty hunter instead of sharpshooter. With all that being said, let's go ahead and get into the skills, and the first one is a passive, marking shot. This will give your attacks a chance up to 15% to mark targets. Marked targets receive 25% additional damage, and how much this status chance is will be determined by whether or not you are dealing with one-handed or two-handed weapons. Two-handed weapons have a greater chance to inflict this particular status. Obviously, I was focused on regular attacks, so this was great to have. It was basically just a straight-up damage boost all the time, so definitely something you want to add into the passive ability list. Next skill is Deadly Shot. You're going to strike a target enemy with a well-aimed shot, dealing a certain amount of physical damage while also doing an additional 120% weapon damage. This skill has synergy with the shaken and vulnerable statuses. If the target is shaken, your attack will ignore 20% of the target's armor, and the same will happen if the target is vulnerable. So potentially you could ignore up to 40% of the target's armor while dealing a massive amount of damage. You have two different upgrade paths for this option. You have two different upgrade paths for this skill. If you go the limb targeting route, it's going to significantly increase the amount of damage you're able to do and increases the amount of armor that you could potentially avoid depending on what debuffs the enemy already has. The headshot option is also going to significantly increase how much armor you can potentially ignore, but it's going to deal 250% weapon damage while also dealing 1 physical damage for each mana point you spent to deal this attack. And using this skill is going to spend all of your current mana. Personally, I didn't think it was worth going this route because the ranger, more than likely you're not heavily investing into mana, so this isn't going to do a ton of extra damage. Makes more sense to go the limb targeting route, and I did go ahead and pick this up as a way to deal large damage to single targets. Next on the list is Scouting Drone, which is going to send out a drone that cannot be targeted. It's going to travel for 10 seconds, bouncing off walls, and then it will reveal a 6-meter area around it and inflict marked on all spotted enemies, which again is going to increase the damage you can do to them by 25%. And I'm sorry, not just you, but your entire team. So this can absolutely be a great way to set up your entire squad to deal massive damage to enemy groups. The Steady Hand passive activates while you're in cover and gives you an additional 8% critical chance. Personally, I don't think this is worth it. You're already going to get a massive increase in critical chance from wind stance, and in general for rangers, critical chance is something that's very easy to pump up. I'm already, even without this, I've got 95% sitting there. I don't think you need to add this to your passive list, especially since you can only have 4 passives anyway. Bunker Buster throws an explosive charge at target cover, destroying it and dealing physical damage to enemies within 4 meters of it. It's also going to inflict slow on those enemies. Slow reduces an enemy's movement speed by 50%. Personally, I don't think this is worth it because a lot of enemies don't bother using cover, even the ranged ones. They'll just stand out in the open and shoot at you. So you can't depend on, oh, well, this character is ranged, so they're going to search out cover and stand behind it. So the times when this will actually be useful are too few, and even if it was more frequent, a lot of times it would make more sense to just straight up shoot the enemies and ricochet those bullets into other targets. Singular focus is a toggle, and it allows you to use a focus stance that grants an additional 15% weapon damage and +2 max range to ranged weapons and skills, but at the same time it applies a negative 90% movement speed to your character. I absolutely do not recommend this. There are many times where you're going to have to run fast, dodge out of the way, and do various things in order to avoid damage. Again, I ran a build that was very low endurance, so when the ranger gets hit, he gets hit hard. You don't want to be in a position where you're stuck. I don't think this makes sense. Piercing Shot fires a piercing beam in the target direction, dealing physical damage and 125% weapon damage to enemies in its path. It also has status synergy. If enemies are already shaken, this skill will inflict Armor Strip 8 on enemies. Armor Strip decreases armor with each hit. Piercing Shot has 2 upgrade paths. You can choose Piercing Blast, which is going to increase the damage and causes more armor to be stripped from shaken enemies, or you can choose the Dazing Shot, which is going to deal burn damage and daze enemies along its path. It also has status synergy, where if enemies are confused, the daze effect will last for a longer period of time. Dazed enemies wander aimlessly in a random direction. Personally, I don't like Piercing Shot because it doesn't go out far enough from your character, so it kind of forces you to get much closer than I like to be in order to make use of it and to make sure it's positioned properly, so I ignored this skill. Next is the passive Precision. You can gain up to 40% weapon damage, but there's going to be a negative 25% penalty applied to attack speed. Honestly, I'm torn on this passive. On the one hand, negative 25% attack speed sounds terrible. But on the other hand, I'm already going to be using Wind Stance, right? And this is going to absorb the vast majority of that penalty. And even without using Wind Stance, I'm already at an additional 78% increase to attack speed based on speed. So it could be that even swallowing this penalty, you're pumping out more damage overall due to this 40% increase to your weapon damage. So 6 in one hand, half a dozen in the other. I ignored this during my playthrough, but in hindsight, when I play this game again, which I already plan to do, I might go ahead and pick this up and try it out. Next is another passive, Sniper Training. Your two-handed ranged weapons gain +6 damage and +2 meter range. This certainly isn't bad, but you're so strapped for passive ability slots that I don't think it's worth picking this up. And then finally we have Execution, which is going to launch a powerful blast at the target enemy, dealing physical damage +2 damage for each 1% of the target's missing health. There are 2 ways to upgrade Execution. You can use Execution Spree, which is going to significantly increase the physical damage and give you +4 damage for each 1% of the target's missing health instead of just +2. And if it kills the target, the cooldown on this skill resets automatically. The other option is an Execution Trick Shot, which does the same amount of damage. However, if this skill kills the enemy, the projectile is going to bounce off to the closest enemy, potentially killing 2 in 1. Very nice. So technically this is great, but the problem with this is when you get to these ultimate versions, they're going to cost 130 mana in order to be used. If you look at my attributes, of course, I haven't invested in power at all, so my max mana is not increasing, and overall, I only have 139 mana. So technically, I could use this maybe right at the beginning of combat, but I don't have much mana regeneration either, so it's just very, very doubtful I'm ever going to be able to use this. You could slot it, but I don't think it serves much purpose. So for those who are curious, my overall build probably looks something like this. For my talents, I'm going to go ahead and take the Phantom roll so that I can get out of danger. It lists Wide Blast here, but I'd probably actually use double pistols and get that ricochet ability so that it'll hit multiple enemies within a 6-meter radius. Get Wind Stance for the additional attack speed and the bump for critical chance. Scouting Drone is going to mark a bunch of enemies, increasing the damage that my entire party can do against them. Limb Targeting for boss fights. And then finally, Arrow Hail. I'll probably start out combat with that so that it can help control a particular area and make sure enemies who walk in too close will take some damage. And then for passives, I'm going to take Amplify Poison, being sure to enchant weapons so that they automatically poison enemies. Stun Critical, since I'm going to be doing critical hits all the time. And in hindsight, I originally went with Skill Frenzy, but I'm already heavily investing in speed anyway. So and I'm not focused on using a ton of skills. So the additional cooldowns, I don't think it really helps me that much. I would probably go ahead and give Precision a try and see if the attack speed trade-off is worth it. Plus 40% damage just seems too good to let go of. And then Marking Shot to ensure that my attacks are able to mark enemies. And then all of that together absolutely gives me a fantastic setup that will let me absolutely shred enemies. All right, now let's head over to Cestia, who is my bounty hunter. She's, from an attribute standpoint, set up the same way. Might and speed is the focus with a little bit of mastery. All right, let's get into the skills, starting with the passive sneak attack. Upon breaking invisibility, you're going to gain a 50% increase to attack speed. There are a couple of different skills here that will give you invisibility. Personally, I don't think this is worth it because there are very few passive slots available, and you already have a skill that is going to help increase your attack speed significantly, not up to 50%, but you're most likely heavily investing into speed anyway. So again, I don't think this is worth it and I would skip it. Smoke Screen allows you to roll away in a target direction, applying visibility for 30 seconds. This leaves behind a smoke bomb that inflicts blind on enemies within 3 meters. When you break invisibility, it's also going to grant you an increase to critical damage for 10 seconds. Blind causes all weapon attacks to miss the target. There are 2 ways to upgrade Smoke Screen. You can get Critical Smoke, which is going to increase the amount of time that enemies will be blind, and it also massively increases the critical damage you can do. 86% for my party member. That is bananas. An 86% increase to critical damage for 10 seconds is going to allow you to absolutely rip through enemies. You also have the option to use Berserk Smoke, which is going to still apply invisibility and it's going to give you health regeneration for 10 seconds. Also, the bomb is going to inflict Berserk for 6 seconds on enemies within 3 meters. That's cool, but to me, obviously, Critical Smoke is the direction you want to go, and this is really going to help your damage output. Bounty Mark allows you to survey an area within 3 meters and inflict Marked, Confused, and Berserk on enemies. And casting this does not break your invisibility. When you first unlock this specialization, this is absolutely something you want to have. As I mentioned before, Marked is very useful. Long term, you're probably going to want to get rid of this because you'll have the priority target passive, which allows your attacks to inflict Marked, but even more importantly, it causes you to do a significantly greater amount of critical damage to enemies who are marked. So instead of manually trying to mark enemies, you're just going to want to do your base attacks as often as possible, and they'll just mark enemies while lighting them up as well. The Hunter's Agility passive is going to increase your movement speed. As I've already mentioned before, a passive that increases your movement speed just isn't really worth it. Explosive Cover will cost a summon point, and you get 2 summon points. So you could throw this out, wait 6 seconds, and then throw out another one. It's going to rig a target cover for 60 seconds to explode when damaged, dealing fire damage and inflicting vulnerable on enemies. Casting this does not break invisibility. As I said before, rigging covers to explode just isn't the domain of the Ranger. I personally don't like this and would skip it. Caltrop wire spreads a wire between up to 4 designated points, and it lasts for 16 seconds, inflicting shaken and armor strip 30 on any enemies who cross that threshold. Doing this does not break your invisibility, and it has status synergy with shaken. Enemies who have that debuff will also be immobilized. This is kind of nice to be able to use during boss fights so that you can strip away some of a boss's defenses, but again, I personally don't like using Bounty Hunter for debuffs unless they're giving a flat out damage increase like marked, so personally I skip this. Cheat Death is a passive that triggers once per combat when your HP drops below 10% and immediately heals you for HP and allows you to gain 100% dodge chance and HP regeneration for 4 seconds. No, there's under the tactical in research, there's an option to be able to revive any dead party members once per dungeon. That's what you'll use when you're about to be close to death. I don't focus on trying to healing or what's going to happen if they get at low HP. Instead, you should be diligently using smoke screen or blast roll to help ensure that your bounty hunter isn't in these types of situations. Death from above drops rockets in a target area, dealing fire damage and inflicting vulnerable on enemies. There's also status synergy. If enemies are vulnerable, they're going to experience Shatter Resistance 1 for 20 seconds. Shatter Resistance decreases all elemental resistances by 25% except Chaos. There are 2 upgrade paths for Death from Above. Kinetic Bombardment will significantly increase the fire damage that each rocket deals. Chaos Warheads is going to increase the amount of rockets you drop from 4 to 12, but causing this deal significantly less damage, but it's going to be 46 chaos damage, which the vast majority of enemies are not going to be able to resist. And these rockets will inflict confused on enemies within 1.4 meters. There's also status synergy. Enemies that are already confused will also be dazed. Personally, I don't like this skill because either you're doing the Chaos Warheads, which is clearly focused around debuffing enemies, which the Bounty Hunter shouldn't be doing, or you're using Kinetic Bombardment, which focuses on fire damage. And there are a lot of enemies that are immune to fire damage, so there'll be a bunch of times when this flat out isn't useful. Personally, I skip this skill. Last on the list, Stealth Beacon emits a stealth field in a 3-meter radius that grants allies invisibility when they step into it, up to 4 times. It's also going to inflict marked on enemies within 10 meters. This can be fantastic to deploy when your group is being besieged by enemies from all sides. There are 2 upgrade paths for Stealth Beacon. Restorative Beacon is going to give you HP regeneration for 10 seconds up to 4 times, in addition to granting invisibility. Augmenting Beacon also will make your party invisible and mark enemies, but when you break invisibility, it's going to grant you 20% increase to crit chance, a 50% increase to crit damage, and a 50% increase to movement speed for 10 seconds. Absolutely fantastic for your entire party. This is definitely something you're going to want to pick up. And for those who are curious, this is how I would probably set up a build for a bounty hunter. So for weapons, I would definitely still use pistols to get that ricochet. Phantom roll, obviously, for get out of jail free cards, and then critical smoke. Also a get out of jail free, but it's the one that I'm going to use way more consistently than this one to get that critical damage up as often as possible. Wind stance, obviously arrow hail, I've already mentioned that, and then augmenting beacon, I mentioned before why that's so fantastic. And then for passives, obviously we're going to want that poison damage increase along with enchanting poison weapons. Stun criticals, she does critical attacks very consistently, automatically marking targets and getting that increase to critical damage when enemies are marked. And then finally, she has room for skill frenzy, so she's going to be able to use these abilities a lot more often than Malachi is able to use his. And then finally, unfortunately, I don't have a save that allows me to go back and see all the options that we have for Gunslinger. but I will go over at least the abilities that I have available here. The first skill is TNT Barrel. You're going to summon one that will explode when damaged, dealing burn damage and inflicting burn on all units within 3 meters. If enemies are already confused, this will also inflict daze. Again, I don't particularly care for using abilities on my ranger that only deal burn damage. I want to make sure the damage I inflict is always going to apply, and there are a lot of enemies that are immune to burn damage. And I don't particularly care for summoning or having to use skills in order to deal damage. I just self-buff and let my regular attacks carve through enemies, so personally I ignore this. Double roll allows you to roll twice in short succession, dropping caltrops along the chosen paths. These caltrops are going to slow enemies and cause them to bleed. Bleeding enemies receive physical damage when moving. So this could be a pretty nice get out of jail free card, but it's not superior to critical smoke. So personally, I wouldn't use it. There's probably a case to be made that it might be superior to phantom roll, since the caltrops will drop along the path. So they don't necessarily have to be right beside you when you use this in order for enemies to be impacted. But overall, considering everything else I already have available, I would skip this. Blinding Shots fires 3 bullets at enemies in a cone, dealing burn damage and inflicting vulnerable with each bullet. Enemies that are already vulnerable experience blind instead. Again, I don't like dealing only fire damage, and I don't care about inflicting statuses with my ranger, so the fact that it can apply vulnerable doesn't matter to me either. And then finally you get Grenade, which throws an explosive charge at a target area, dealing physical and burn damage on enemies within 2 meters. If enemies are shaken or vulnerable, they'll experience additional physical damage or experience additional fire damage. This one is interesting because the cooldown is only 6 seconds. So you can lob grenades over and over and over again at enemies, which even though, again, I prefer to deal damage that's just automatically going to apply, this does sound like it's probably a lot of fun to use. There are 2 upgrade paths for this skill. So one of them is Frag Grenade, which is going to cause the physical and fire damage that you deal to significantly increase. And then the other one is Pulse Grenade, which only deals a little bit more damage, but it's going to inflict knockdown on enemies that are shaken and shatter resistance 1 on enemies that are vulnerable. Knockdown prevents enemies from performing any action, and the enemy takes 25% more damage from weapon attacks. So basically, it's a more advanced version of Marked. Being able to throw out pulse grenades every 6 seconds while throwing out bullets in between, again, that actually kind of sounds like fun. So there could definitely be some merit to the specialization, but again, unfortunately, I can't show you the rest of the skills that are associated with it. And that completes my overview of Ranger. Hopefully you found this helpful and it gave you some interesting ideas about how you can make use of this class. We will definitely review the rest of the classes over the course of this week. Hope all of you enjoyed this video. Take care.